Hey boys and girls, it is time to read our last chapter of Ferdinand Magellan. So today our voyage ends. So remember, so sad how we ended last chapter, that Ferdinand Magellan had been killed, right? By the native people of that island. So his body was never found. So let's see what happens. How does this finish? Okay. So chapter 10, end of the journey. On November 18th, 1521, more than 2 years after leaving Spain. So it's been over 2 years. So think, you are 6 years old. A lot of you are. I know we have some 7-year-olds and maybe a couple 5-year-olds, but let's go with 6. So let's say you're 6 years old and you leave and you're gone and you don't come back till you're 8 years old. Do you think your mom and dad would recognize you? Would they say, "Who are you?" Right? So these guys had been gone for over 2 years, right? So on November 18th, 1521, more than 2 years after leaving Spain, the Trinidad and the Victoria finally reached India. 3 months later, the Victoria sailed home to Spain, loaded down with spices. The ship arrived, a ghost of herself, on September 6, 1522. After 27,000 miles, she was rotted through and leaking. So Victoria left India and got all the way back to Spain. But the ship looked horrible, right? It was rotting and leaking. Just 18 of the crew were still alive on the Victoria ship. Even so, nobody in Spain expected anyone to return. Long ago, everyone on Ferdinand's expedition had been given up for dead. So here they come off the boat, these 18 crew members off of the Victoria, right? And they just look ragged. Nobody thought they'd ever show up again. Yet the few survivors had accomplished what Ferdinand Magellan set out to do. They had sailed around the world. The men were greeted as heroes. King Charles invited them to his palace. But the spices they brought home earned only enough money to pay for the expense of the trip. For all the hope of riches that sent Ferdinand Magellan to sea, there was no profit made from this voyage. So the voyage, although they set out thinking, oh, we'll become rich and famous, they weren't rich. They really had no money to speak of when they got home. Now they did become famous, right? Because they had sailed around the globe, but they weren't rich. So the other ship, the Trinidad, also left India. But after 3 months at sea, with the crew dying from scurvy, the ship returned back to the island. So the Trinidad tried to leave, but then went back. And 3 years later, it finally showed back up in Spain with only 4 men on board. So we had 18 on Victoria and 4 on the Victoria. So 18, 19, 20, 21, 22. There were only 22 survivors from this whole expedition. I believe they started out with, over 200. So, all right. So 3 years later, the Trinidad finally showed up in Spain. And the Captain General, Ferdinand Magellan, he was a forgotten man. His wife and child were dead. He had died halfway through the journey. Most of his men spoke poorly of him when they mentioned him at all. The expedition was considered a failure. The long, difficult route had made no money for traders. Other captains who set out on the same route as Magellan couldn't even find Ferdinand Strait. Remember that strait? That's narrow piece of water that connects the big oceans together? The long voyage seemed to have accomplished very little. But of course, it had accomplished a lot. Now people knew that the world was much larger than they had originally thought. For the first time, there was proof that the Pacific and the Atlantic Oceans were connected, and there was absolute proof that the earth was round, right? It had to be round, or they would have fallen off, right? So I'm going to let you look at this picture of the entire voyage. I think this is a really neat picture. So the earth was round and covered with so much water that circling it in a ship was possible. As the years passed, people came to realize how daring Ferdinand Magellan's voyage had been. This fierce little man had changed what they knew about the world. A new age of exploration began, with voyages all over the Pacific Ocean. Maps were redrawn and globes came into use. The great civilizations of Europe, Asia, and the Pacific were brought closer. Ferdinand had started it all. Today, Ferdinand Magellan is famous for being a great seaman, a brilliant navigator, and a bold explorer. Ferdinand Magellan sailed thousands of miles only to die without purpose on a strange beach. Yet, though he didn't complete his journey, he is recognized, and rightly so, as the first man to sail around the world. What an explorer he was. I just think it's amazing to think about a time in our world that they didn't know that our earth was round and that you could sail around it, that there was so much water. I just think it's fascinating that they learned this. So it's been fun sharing Ferdinand with you, and my desire for you is to be bold and to explore and to find new things, right? That's what he did, and I think that's a valuable lesson for us. So I will see you guys soon. Bye.